Hi, everybody. Welcome to Adirondack Architectural Heritage's first webinar of 2022. We are so very happy to have you all joining us remotely this Tuesday evening. Thank you for taking the time out of your evening to be with us tonight. My name is Erin Tobin. I'm the Executive Director of Adirondack Architectural Heritage. And with me tonight is David Thomas Train from Friends of Poke-O-Moonshine, and Nolan Kuhl, who's AARCH's Educational Program Director. Nolan will be monitoring the chat and helping us run the program. And I'm just figuring out my controls here, so bear with me. I wanted to share a little bit and to thank our partners tonight. Of course, we have Friends of Poke-O-Moonshine, and we have the New York State chapter of the Forest Fire Lookout Association. Both strong partners and critical to fire tower preservation in the Adirondacks and beyond. Of course, there we go. So Adirondack Architectural Heritage, otherwise known as AARCH, was founded in 1990 with the mission to preserve the architectural communities of the Adirondacks and the region surrounding through education, action, and advocacy. We are based in Keysville, but we work throughout the Adirondack region. And the pillars of our work, public education, advocacy and action, partnerships, technical assistance, and fee-for-service work. I'm sure many of you are members, and those even who aren't, I'm sure are familiar with our wonderful summer tour programs and our advocacy to protect places like Great Camp Santanoni. The photos, we'll just go there. A Great Camp Santanoni in Newcomb, which was preservation of Camp Santanoni was one of our founding goals achieved in 1992, 2 years after AARCH was founded, and with a Camp Santanoni historic area created in 2000. You can visit Great Camp Santanoni any time of the year. It's a 5-mile ski into the main lodge that you see here, or snowshoe in the winter months, or you can walk or bike, or for those who need, there's a carriage to get you out to the main lodge and the beautiful lake. You can see here we have some of our tours going out to the camp are available each year, and we host summer interns. Our work at Camp Santanoni, where this year we finished the largest capital project to date, a full roof replacement on the main lodge, which you're looking at now, as well as the gate lodge and other important repair work, is a partnership between AARCH and the State Department of Environmental Conservation, who of course owns the land, and the town of Newcomb, where Camp Santanoni sits. And of course, we also have been a part of saving fire towers almost since our founding. Stephen Engelhardt, the founding executive director, worked with David to preserve the Poke-O-Moonshine Fire Tower starting back in 1997, and shortly thereafterwards, the Friends was founded and became a part of AARCH, nesting under our nonprofit status. And of course, AARCH is more than just beautiful buildings or buildings themselves. We save places and tell the stories, the broader stories that define the Adirondacks, the stories that maybe haven't been told as strongly over the years. And we're always working to tell a more complete story of our region and the people who were there, because the buildings are, of course, about the people who built them, who live there, who work there, and who love them. So you will hear more from us at the end of the talk. We're looking forward tonight to learning more about fire towers and specifically the Poke-O-Moonshine Fire Tower from David. I had the pleasure of seeing a portion of this PowerPoint, maybe the whole thing, a couple of weeks ago. And it was such a fabulous talk, and it's so much good information about fire towers that are something that has personally always fascinated me. And I hope you all also enjoy the program. So David, I am going to turn it over to you. David Thomas Train is the administrator for Friends of Poke-O-Moonshine. He's responsible for those of you who are part of Friends, and I hope all of you become a part of Friends. And if you're not a part of AARCH, please join us and follow the state chapter of the New York State chapter of the Forest Fire Lookout Association. And he's responsible for the wonderful communications you receive.
I am the coordinator of the Friends of Poke-O-Moonshine and work out of the offices of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, and an employee of AARCH also. And as Erin said, that her predecessor, Stephen Engelhardt, and I co-founded the Friends of Poco in 1997. And that was really after a number of fire towers had been restored in the Adirondacks. The first one being, I believe, the tower at Blue Mountain Lake. The first tower restored for interpretive and educational purposes, and staffed by college students who were trained to meet and greet and interact with the hiking public. And that was, I don't know the exact year, that was in the early 1990s. And that was a joint project of the Adirondack Mountain Club and I believe Hamilton County Cooperative Extension, and of a successful outset for restoration of fire towers. And at that point in well, I think I'll get to the slides and go through the sort of historical trajectory. I do want to give a disclaimer first. I am by no means an expert on Adirondack fire towers. There are many of you who know far more details about them, and feel free to correct any mistakes that I may make. And absolutely welcome your input, and of course your interest and your participation. So the fire tower story begins with the logging story of the Adirondacks in the 1800s, early 1900s, and there was logging throughout much of the mountains, and most of it was unregulated in the sense we know of logging regulations these days. No limit on the size of trees or the amount of acreage, or where the logging slash could be left, and or how it would be left. And I want to thank the forest rangers, New York State forest rangers. Most of these images come from their website, really some great imagery. And this is logging slash, site unidentified, but the stuff is piled 10, 15, 20 feet high. And the early 1900s were dry, droughty years. The lumber was taken out of the woods by train, and those trains, the locomotives spewed sparks, on into the woods and began to ignite areas of extreme slash, such as this. And fire resulted. This is not a specific fire site. This is more generic forest fire photograph. But the Adirondack woods became broadly ablaze, smoke spreading throughout the Northeast. So there was a great deal of awareness and fear of forest fires as the major environmental threat to life and property. And this was the resulting landscape. The forest ecosystem was essentially destroyed. Skeleton of trees, non-functioning filtration of the soil, so huge erosion problems, and no longer a healthy habitat for either water filtration or forest ecology, wildlife, of course. This is a photograph looking back down the train tracks from a small hamlet west of Tupper Lake known as Sabattis that was surrounded completely by fire and had to be evacuated, as I understand it, by train. And luckily no one was injured or severely hurt. Extreme property damage, even in this small hamlet. And people had to take literally the last train out to save their lives. And it became something of a poster child, Sabattis did, for the fear, or if you will, the terror that people experienced and felt with forest fires throughout the mountains. This is, to me, quite an informative map. The red areas are the areas that burned in the 1903 forest fires. The line, I hope you can see my cursor. This is the then blue line of the Adirondack Park. It has since extended over to Lake Champlain, and then this is Lake George here, just to orient you. Great deal of fire damage in the north and the northwest of the Adirondacks. Interestingly, as I think I alluded, I live in Keene Valley in this area, and my dad, who was very young at the time, and I think had these stories handed down to him, probably not a reliable eyewitness though, but told us that the valley, of course, now known as home of the high peaks, was surrounded by fire, and that three of the four ways out, Chapel Pond Pass, Spruce Hill to the east towards Elizabethtown, Cascade Pass to the northwest towards North Elba, those three were all afire and blocked by fire, and the only way out by road was to the north, down the Osable Valley, which would have been in this direction. Is that cursor coming across, Aaron?
Yes, it is. We can see the cursor. This is perfect.
You can see it. Good.
Yes.
Right. So fire really in the town I live in really on all sides, and people trapped in a mountain valley. And my dad recounted tales of people putting their sort of family treasures in sacks, in rock-weighted sacks, in the brooks, in the streams, so that they could survive the fire. So in general, a time of great fear and panic. This was the first year of heavy fires, 1903. Essentially the first decade and a half was the heavy fire era in the Adirondacks. This is a shot overlooking Chapel Pond Pass. Many of you will recognize, even though it's quite a fuzzy old print, Giant Mountain in the back to the east, and Rocky Peak to the right. Round Mountain in the foreground. This is taken from a ledge on Noonmark looking east. Just an area of complete devastation. Now, not asking you to read all the fine print. The two dates at the top, these were the years of the principal fires, 1903 and 1908. But the gist of this slide is here in the bottom in the red, this chart with the 2 years. And this time span encompassed the establishment by the state of a system of fire warnings and through fire wardens, and the beginnings of communication amongst them for calling up fire companies to begin to extinguish fires. And the statistics here at the bottom are telling, in that by 1908, there was almost double the number of fires, but less than half the acreage burned. 177,000 to 500,000 acres. And so, of course, the gist of this is that the fire warden system, the warning system, the communication system was effective, and less of the forest was burning. So the state continued and proceeded. Informally, the fire towers were extremely local in their design, obviously built with local materials. Nowadays, people would be proud of that with the buy local slogan, and of course, the most locally and readily available material was what else but wood. So the fire towers were ad hoc designs, put up spur of the moment, and meant to give a wider picture of the view shed, of course, of that mountain. This is one of my favorites. Absolutely using local materials. This is on Tammany Mountain in, I believe, Hamilton County, 1909. This picture was taken. Looks to me like I don't know if you would call it the stairway to heaven or the stairway to where, but those guardrails and those steps would make me second guess an ascent up that fire tower, up the trunk of a white pine. But readily available, quickly constructed. And at this point, the forerunner of the DEC was called the Conservation Commission. And the commissioner, head of the commission, was a man named George Pratt. And he decided that fire towers, one, should be made of metal, unburnable materials to the degree possible, and standardized in their construction. And so the state began, of course, to put up what we now recognize visually as fire towers with angle iron steel, initially procured from windmill companies, windmills that pumped water for farms in the Midwest. The main company that provided parts was called the Aeromotor Company. And I confess, and I'm sure some of you in the audience know this, whether or not Aeromotor is still extant and in business, but strong, reliable structures. And an interesting contrast between those and their predecessors. This is the same tower. It was on Mount Adams, just outside of the high peaks. Let me go back. That is a view of Marcy, right behind that leg of the tower. So this is just south of the absolute center of the high peaks. And the tower that this one replaced was not much more formal than rungs of wood between two trees. Considerably shorter, considerably less sturdy, and considerably more prone to fire. Cost about $500 materials and labor. The back to the same slide, the mode of transportation is shown here in the center. I've lost my cursor again, but there's a horse that these were horse-drawn loads of angle iron steel that were pulled up rudimentary trails, and there's a horse near the center left of the photograph, just below the small ladder that's angling from center towards lower left a little bit. So and there's an observer up in this tower. It gives you a sense of the scale. I believe the Mount Adams Tower is, well, this is a guess. I'm guessing it's about 45, 50 feet tall. And one of you may know that exactly. You can add that to the chat, and Nolan will pick up on that. But I apologize, I don't know. Part of what the state did in allocating resources was create fire districts. And these pink areas were the fire districts. These in the teens and the 20s, of course, were the forested areas of New York State. And the rest was open land, theoretically less susceptible to fire, more easily reportable in terms of fire danger. So even Lake Long Island was heavily wooded. The eastern end was heavily wooded at that time, and that constituted fire district number 11 there at the bottom. So the state was really doing a full court press with the towers, with the fire districts, and with communication. And again, not expecting you to speed read through the fine print, but what this says in here, it's just the key sentence, really. All persons are warned that they will be held responsible for any damage or injury to the forest, which may result from their carelessness or neglect. So the state was dead serious on this effort. And some of you may know, and be happy if you would like to share it during the Q&A. to what degree any violators were caught and fined for fires that they were responsible for. And this is an interesting photo to me. Of course, it shows the map table being demonstrated essentially in a studio, and the circular map table showing the 360-degree view shed of the particular mountain, be that Adams or Whiteface or Lion or Poke-O-Moonshine. And a primitive but effective technical device. And as almost all of you know, this was a visual spotter of smoke and of fires, and it was known as a firefinder. And the bar in the middle, usually constructed of brass, was a swiveling pointer and could literally be aimed at the smoke, and the observer would be looking down the line of that bar, known as an alidade, and establishing a line on the map where the fire would be located, somewhere along that line, and then in communication with the next fire tower to nearby, so that they could engage in the same process, and then with use of geometry they could triangulate the exact location of the fire, and compass degrees were printed around the circumference of the map, so that the observer would be able to take a reading and come closer to pinpointing the fire. Something else that was standardized for the observers was a place to live, place to stay, a cabin. This is a cabin on Mount Arab near Tupper Lake, obviously a contemporary photograph, in the summit meadow, and this is the original design, standardized design of the cabin, with a room or two in the back, and with a chimney, and of course a fireplace, if not a wood stove, and a porch in the front. And many of the cabins are still standing. Some are in better repair than others. This one has been ingeniously reinvented as a small museum about Mount Arab, about the fire tower, and about the history of fire detection and warning there on the mountain. Friends of Mount Arab have really done an excellent job with the displays and the interpretation that they carry on there. Some of the towers, of course, were quite short and squat. This was one of the shortest ones on Whiteface. It was only 22 feet in height, I believe. And the reason being that this was an unforested summit, so you did not need to be above the tree line, or have a sight line above the trees to detect fires. And of course, that's not the case on all mountains. This is Wakely Mountain that has one of the tallest fire towers. This is approximately 80 feet tall, and tall enough that those guy wires are really required. I haven't been up the Wakely Tower. I must say that I do find the tall fire towers massive and quite cavernous and fairly daunting. Poke-O-Moonshine Fire Tower comes in at a mere 35 feet tall, and this is you could easily fit two of the Poke-O-Moonshine towers within this structure. And yes, it does, as I understand, it does do some swaying in the wind. The Poke-O-Moonshine Tower, as far as I've experienced it, does not sway in the wind, but it becomes musical and it hums, takes on a rather fine high pitch hum in a high wind. And this is not wind damage. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the state had decreed that some of the fire towers should come out, that those that were in areas, according to the new state land master plan, areas designated as wilderness or primitive areas were deemed as non-conforming traces of the presence of humanity on the mountaintop, rather than a supposedly pristine, unsullied view from the top. And so the state began to remove towers and began to say that it would use aerial detection from scheduled flights over the entire park. And that was an effort that, as I understand it, never really took off, or was fully utilized. It had too many gaps in it, and again, I would appreciate comments from any of the audience afterwards about the demise of that proposed system. Other towers by the 1980s began to have a different fate. This is two shots of the same tower at Azure Mountain, taken about a year apart, and this tower was slated to come down, and up from the grassroots sprung a local group that of hikers, of historians, of relatives and friends of former fire observers, which made up a strong constituency for fire towers, saying that no, they should not come down. They are a piece of history. They are a piece of important and vital piece of the story of protecting the forests and protecting the forest ecology and the watersheds of the Adirondacks. And they have a valuable story to tell. And as I understand it, the fledgling Friends of Mount Azure petitioned the state to keep the tower standing when it was in this condition on the left, rusted and in pretty rough condition, probably not extremely safe to climb up, and of course not easily climbable with the bottom two sets of risers removed to discourage hikers from climbing. And the Friends of Azure were, as I understand it, were given a year. They said, if you can get the tower restored within a year, you can keep it keep it standing. It was not in a wilderness or a primitive area, and so there was no mandate from on high that it must come down. So the Friends of Azure had some wiggle room, and they took advantage of it. And within a year, this is on the right, is what the Azure Mountain Fire Tower looked like. The stairs restored, the angle irons restored, repainted, sanded, and in good shape, ready to go with safety fencing. And I'm not sure now if the Azure Tower has glass or plexiglass, or I believe the last I heard was it was still an enclosed but open space without glass or plexiglass. And again, one of you would be greatly appreciated if you could clarify that. Every fire tower that is restored is done a little bit differently, depending on the use of the mountain, the location of what seems best, of the technical skills of the group that is working on it with DEC oversight. And this, I believe, was in the 1980s. This decade of wiggle room, as I called it, that the Friends of Azure had. And towers, no, I apologize. Of course, it was later than the 80s. It was in the 1990s. And at that point, fire towers were still continuing to be brought down. And Azure existed really in a lucky vacuum in a wild forest area that was not subject to the strictures of the state land master plan on removal of fire towers as non-conforming structures. Whoops, I apologize. Let's see. I'm not sure why this came up. Hold on. Okay. All right. Yep. Okay, we're going to zip through. So Azure had, I suppose you would call it the luxury of a year. At least it had a year. The Hurricane Tower, as I understand, had a demolition crew scheduled to come and was only saved by the fact that some members of that crew called in sick that day. And so they postponed work. And the Longwear family, who were instrumental in saving Hurricane, took absolute advantage of that, got petitions going, raised money, and kept full pressure on the DEC. This is not Hurricane, this is the Poke-O-Moonshine Tower. And these are 3 rangers who are working on putting in new diagonals in the tower. There was an engineering test done for the tower. DEC determined that, yes, lo and behold, the tower was strong. They did require that new diagonals be put in. And so this is the near the end of that workday when the new diagonals were installed. An interesting story related to this Gary Friedrich, the ranger in charge, the Poke-O-Moonshine and ranger, who was tremendously helpful to our efforts. And I believe that's Gary on the left in the red or pink shirt. Said that of course, those diagonals were not taken up by horse or muleback in the 1990s, but they were flown up by helicopter. And he had an interesting tale about that, because the load of diagonals slung by cable below the helicopter started swinging, and it was apparently quite a windy day, and the pilot was concerned that they were going to swing up high enough into the rotors of the helicopter, and so he did what was called punching the load. In other words, he dropped the load. It happened that he was over a lake, and it happened that that lake was the Butternut Pond, which is the reservoir, the municipal water supply for Keysville. And Gary was tasked late that afternoon. It was not sunny, clear, lovely weather like this picture, but a gray, steely, cold, sleety November afternoon of heading out across Butternut Pond and paddling. Of course, being a reservoir, no motors allowed on it, and to see if he could find this cross bracing. And it was dusky, late afternoon. He was about ready to call it quits, and he caught a little glimpse of, or a glint, better said, of the steel poking up out of the water 2 or 3 feet at the marshy end of Butternut Pond, and they had apparently just bulleted vertically straight down into the muck and were protruding. So he was able to locate them. They were able to be recovered, helicoptered back out, and taken up to the tower. And they are there now, somewhere on the Poke-O-Moonshine Fire Tower. Perhaps a tiny bit, with a tiny bit more wear and tear than the others, but the tower is sturdy and solid. It doesn't sway. It just hums in the wind, a beautiful soft tune. And most of you will know that these are the locations of standing towers. The more reddish surrounded stars are the mountaintop ones. The purple ones are 2 museum towers, one at the Adirondack History Museum in Elizabethtown up here, and the other at Adirondack Experience, formerly the Adirondack Museum in Blue Mountain Lake. And this map was current as of 2005, and more towers have been restored since then. There is the effort to install a fire tower in Speculator over here at the town park as an interpretive site off a mountain for the non-hiking public to experience fire towers and their history. And the Whiteface Fire Tower is here at Blue Mountain Lake, the 22-foot tall tower we talked about. And the tower in Elizabethtown is a hybrid tower from Hamilton County, I believe. It's got part of both towers, Kempshall Mountain, and I'm not sure what I should know. I should know which tower it is. The second tower, it's a hybrid tower that the museum bought from the state for a very few dollars. and they are standing proudly next to the museum building, a former school, a great educational site. One of the initiatives that Fire Tower Friends groups have done, and we had mentioned Blue Mountain, like the Blue Mountain Fire Tower has been to create interpretive flyers, educational brochures about the mountain, about the fire tower, and about the human and natural history of the locale. And Blue Mountain has numbered stops along the trail, an interpretive trail. So this is actually a trail guide. And the other mountains that have these interpretive flyers, Hadley, Arab, Goodnow, Blue, and Owl's Head, take into account the forest ecology and the sites that hikers would see on the way of a hike up the mountain. The Goodnow interpretive flyer is interesting because it comes in both a summer or a warm season and a winter edition. So it's a little bit more finely toothed than some of the others. And this is a shot of the Hurricane Tower before its final restoration in 1999. I believe Peter Slocum, the head of Friends of Hurricane, told me that restoration was completed in 1999. And this is the same. You can see the same condition, the very rusty tower, the two bottom sets of risers removed, and I can attest that those were not much of an impediment to get past hikers. In my younger days, I was gamely able to shinny up and then carefully tiptoe up the ladder and take advantage of the view from that much higher. This is a view looking east, some clouds over Lake Champlain in this area. And those of you who know Hurricane know it has a fantastic 360-degree view. And my parents had a tale of climbing Hurricane with my oldest brother, I would say in the early 1950s. It happened to be a day that the Observer was off duty, and they were up there. They happened to spot a fire near Upper J and were able to get up the tower and work the radio system and report the fire. Even on a day when the Observer might not be present, fires could be reported, as they certainly are now, as we all know, largely by cell phone, though certainly not exclusively. And so this was Hurricane about 10, 15 years ago. And this is the restored tower at Owl's Head Mountain near Long Lake. And this is a tower that has the steel has been reconditioned. It's not up or visible yet, but safety fencing. And there is a map and a map table. And of course, as we saw on an earlier slide, there is an interpretive brochure for the mountain. This Owl's Head is not a super heavily hiked trail such as Hurricane or Poke-O-Moonshine is. And so the locals who were interested in this initiative decided, at least at the outset, not to hire a tower steward to meet and greet the public. And an interesting footnote on that is that by the year 2010, the state in effect did a 180-degree turn on fire tower policy and agreed not only that fire towers had historical value and should not be removed, but the state would also fund their restoration, maintenance, and interpretation. And the state DEC has been a great partner with the Friends of Poke-O-Moonshine and the ranger there. Gary Friedrich's successor, Dan Levy, has been a tremendous help to our efforts. So towers are now restored largely with state money and maintained and interpreted with state funding.
We had a question on your last presentation about how many fire towers were lost or taken down. Do you know how many have been lost?
I believe there were approximately 55 Adirondack fire towers at their heyday. And at this point, quite a number of those have been restored, and I'm just trying to look for the exact number. Oh, excuse me, 1 second.
Well, David is looking, and of course, because he's the host, I am not able to turn my camera on. My apologies, but I'll try to troubleshoot that during his Poke-O-Moonshine section of the talk. But I just wanted to let everybody know, for our AARCH members who are in the audience today, stay tuned for your winter newsletter that will be arriving in the coming weeks in your mailbox, because we're going to be featuring fire towers. So if you liked this presentation, you'll learn even more about fire towers in our upcoming newsletters. That's a little sneak peek. And if you join before then, you'll get that newsletter in your mail if you're not a member already.
As an update to that number, Erin, as of this year, 26 publicly accessible fire towers were either undergoing or had undergone restoration. So approximately half of the original number. Some of the that demolished tower we saw lying akimbo on a mountain summit, that was Tea Lake Mountain in Hamilton County. And some towers were dynamited like that and left to decay. Others were taken down more carefully, as the museum fire towers would suggest, and used as restored fire towers at museums. So towers have been restored in many different ways. They've also been taken down in several different ways. But according to my count, which may certainly not be absolutely accurate, there are 26 that are Adirondack towers that are now under restoration or have been restored.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the work at Poke-O-Moonshine, since we did see pictures.
I would be happy to. And obviously I don't want to go on overly long about it. It would it would be much better to have the images, but picking up the story, and can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to keep trying this while I'm going to keep trying to fiddle while I'm off screen share.
Okay.
See if I can get this.
Could you tell us a little bit while you're doing that about the recent grant from Parks and Trails New York and the work that you're doing on the trail, perhaps going up to the fire tower?
Yes, absolutely. Where we left the story off of Poke-O-Moonshine was back in 1997. Stephen Engelhardt and I were able to recruit a group of interested local folks who wanted to take on the task, and or I would say that a main thrust of our mission with POCO has been the educational one of the story of the human and natural history of the mountain, the role of fire towers in protecting that natural history and the natural environment of the mountain. And as a popular mountain, extremely popular mountain, and as many of you know, I'm sure, it's close to Plattsburgh. It's very close to the Northway. And so it's an accessible, highly accessible hiking mountain, also popular rock climbing mountain throughout the Northeast. So POCO is a bit of an icon. It's a large, huge piece of rock, 1,000 feet high out of the lowlands, and has 3 or 4 impressive bands of cliffs. So people have always flocked to POCO. It's iconic. It's a bit magnetic, if you will, and so we determined that given the hiker usage of POCO, that it made sense to staff the tower with an interpreter. And our first fire tower steward were hired in 2002, 2003, and were environmental studies students, either from SUNY Potsdam or SUNY Plattsburgh. Plattsburgh being the not too far from POCO. It was a logical fit, and we have tried to be as comprehensive as possible in our messaging to the hiking public and in our maintenance of the trails. And so we have always had a subcommittee. We've had a trails chairperson to recruit volunteers for work parties and keep the 2 trails on the mountain in good shape. Again, if I could bring up this slideshow, I could give you a lot more detail. I'm still trying. And again, I'll just keep on with the story. So we have hired tower stewards since the early 2000s. Some have stayed and come back for a second summer. They've enjoyed it so much and done such an effective job that they and we have agreed for them to return. We are now, I think, about to begin a season with our 24th tower steward, who will be in her second summer on the mountain. Very effective tower steward named Bianca Lynch, an environmental studies student from SUNY Plattsburgh. So I'll just give Bianca a shout out and thank her for the great work that she has done. Poco is a steep mountain. It rises 1,000 feet in a mile or so. That's steepness. And what happens to steep trails is that they wash out and erode, especially heavily trafficked trails. And the DEC and we noticed the obvious, that the trail was the historic trail up the mountain, now known as the Ranger Trail up the east side, was eroding and washing out. And in, I believe, 2012, 2011, the DEC decided that the condition of the trail warranted it being closed. And that the second trail on the mountain, known as the Observer's Trail, being a longer and more gentle route, could handle the traffic. The friends of Poke-O-Moonshine had a different view of the issue as the historic route up the mountain, and we do have documents of hikers climbing the east side of the mountain as early as, I believe, 1849. And so it's as with early trails, the direct route was always the most popular. And as with contemporary trails, the most popular trails have become the most eroded and washed out. And we thought, well, we can't let that trail be closed. And we took the board of the Friends of Poke-O-Moonshine, took a big gulp. All right, let's raise the money to restore the trail. And so we began a 5-year project to raise the necessary funds. And we had estimates between widely and wildly varying estimates between $125,000 and $325,000 to restore the 1.2 mile Ranger Trail. And on the face of that, that seems like a lot of money for a trail. But when you factor in that it is hand labor, it is skilled hand labor, that the materials and the tools are all carried by hand up the mountain, and the result ideally is a sustainable, fairly erosion-proof route, not maintenance-free, but largely erosion-proof. No trail is entirely erosion proof. We are certainly fully aware of that, but it's an investment in a sustainable and potentially an interesting route up the mountain. And the old trails, of course, and particularly the fire tower trails, went like an arrow up the mountain. To expedite access to the mountain as quickly as possible. And of course, what happens on the downside is once the rain begins to come down, they find that direct route, and the rain gullies it and erodes it and washes it out. And so an example of this would have been the trail up the former fire tower mountain Ampersand, who essentially has about 1,000 foot, similar to Poke-O-Moonshine, 1,000 foot head wall climb after a long, gentle approach to the mountain. And that was the first trail that had a significant rebuild done to it in the 1980s. And some of that, some of those techniques and tools of installing rock staircases on steep mountainsides are still a major part of the toolkit of trail restoration. But we, of course, felt that why restore the fire tower if people can't easily or enjoyably access it? If our mission is to educate on the ecology of the forest and the forest preserve and the human history of protecting the forest preserve, we need to have a role in protecting that ourselves too. So we bit the bullet, and over 5 years, we were able to raise $250,000 for the trail restoration, which began in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, and was largely completed with some smaller efforts by 2019. There's still some work to do on that. And Aaron was asking about a grant we have just received from the Parks and Trails New York, which works hand in hand with the New York Parks Department with trail renovation money. And we were been able to raise $30,000 from them, which we received in the last 2 weeks. So we will continue with the uppermost steep section of the Ranger Trail this summer. And we have been hugely aided and supported by the stellar work of the Adirondack Mountain Club Professional Trail Crew program and its professional trail crew, which has been at work on the mountain for 6 summers now. And they have partnered with a private company known as Tahalwas Trails that is based in the Catskills, but has worked with ADK a great deal. As you might guess, the world of trail work, mountain trail work in the Northeast is a small world, and the principals all know each other, are familiar with each other, and have worked with each other. And each particular crew has its area of expertise, whether that would be drainage or rock staircases. And so ADK and Tahalwas have been able to partner with us on that project and really done an amazing job. One of the parts of new trail design from these old straight shots up the mountain is to lag the trails out, if you will, or meander them, give them a less direct route up the mountain. Well, less direct route, of course, is slower. So what are the possible upsides to that? You can take the trail by interesting sites. You can take it to an interesting lookout or a cliff face or the edge of a stream that has some interesting plants. And so the new restored trails in the Adirondacks are much more meandering, much less of a direct arrow up to the summit, and consequently much less of a watercourse coming down. And they are built, of course, with drainage structures incorporated into them, which is a lot of what our week-to-week maintenance is during the week season, during the work season in the summer by volunteers. And DEC has been very forthcoming in training our volunteers of of how to do solid and lasting trail maintenance to guard against the erosion problem on what formerly had been a very steep trail. So these projects are teamwork. They are private and public teamwork. We are able to fundraise in the private fundraising world and the not-for-profit fundraising world, and receive grants either from government agencies or other not-for-profits, or from businesses and private individuals who have all been a huge part of it. I think we've had well over 300 donors, individuals and organizations that have supported our trail work on the mountain. And so the Poke-O-Moonshine Tower is now newly, and I would have to say proudly, accessible with a sustainable, meandering, and interesting route up the mountain that takes in some sites that prior to this it did not. And I have to say now it to me, frankly, it's a much more interesting and fun hike rather than a straight and somewhat washed out route straight up the mountain. So we are aiming to, with the $30,000 grant that Aaron mentioned, we're able to proceed with our work this summer on the last significant section of the trail that has not been re-engineered, and it will have a bit of a relocation and several sets of rock staircases going to the top. So the trail itself becomes a model of what we are attempting to educate the public about. This is an environmentally sensible way to get up the mountain, and the trail is a case in point. So I hope I haven't been too wordy on that, but I wanted to fill you in a little bit on that facet of our project.
Great, David. That was really helpful and fascinating. I think trail design in the Adirondacks is something, well, it's outside of the scope of AARCH's mission, as I think we have a lot of overlap between our members and people who like to be outside and hiking. It's an interesting part of the Adirondack story.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I'm still behind the scenes trying to click away on the slideshow and trying to get you some images, but I am having no luck.
Well, we might need to, at this point, I see that it's 8:06, and being aware of time, and I may go to Q&A, and what we can do, I'm going to try, David, I'm going to try to reclaim host, and I've been, while you were presenting, I was trying to fix some of the settings in Zoom. So I'm going to see if it allows us to be co-host, and if not, I'll put it back to you. But let's see if I can be host and then also start my video. Look at that. There we are.
You're the host.
So I didn't want to do that while you were talking in case I cut you off the camera. So there were a couple of questions that I wanted to put out there. The one that I think came up in the Q&A relates to how deep the fire tower legs are buried. So when they're erecting the fire towers, how deep are those legs underground?
Well, they are drilled and anchored into the bedrock of the mountaintop and anchored with concrete footings. I did reference that when the DEC said that the Poke-O-Moonshine Tower could be restored, they did require an engineering test, and they found that the Poco Tower passed that test with flying colors. They had since perhaps admitted that the tower did not need the cross bracing that was installed, that perhaps that was overkill, but better to be safe than to be sorry. But I I don't know exactly how deeply the legs of a tower are drilled into the summit rock, and I'm sure there's someone there in the audience who has that information at their fingertips. And if any of you do know that, please share that on chat, and Aaron can share that information.
That would be great. And I know I'm seeing several people in the chat or in the attendee list, and we're so happy. Among them is Lori Rankin, who runs the New York State chapter of the Forest Fire Lookout Association. So, and probably so many others who have a depth of knowledge about fire towers. So one of the other questions was, so I think we got some interesting facts about the fire towers that have been lost and that have been restored and are publicly accessible or undergoing restoration. And you might have touched on this a bit, but are there fire towers that are still standing that have yet to be restored? And I'll qualify this by saying in the Adirondacks, because that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah. There are towers that, yes, the answer is yes. Earlier on, I indicated that there were 26 towers that had been or were under restoration. Under restoration would mean having an agreement between a friends group and the DEC to work cooperatively to restore the particular tower. And I know that the Lion Mountain Tower at the very northern fringe of the park is in process. It's not fully restored. At the southern end of the park, there is a tower on Cathead Mountain, and that is going through various levels of decision making and agreement towards restoration. So yes, the answer to that is yes. There are towers. New York, I believe the rough number of towers that New York State put up originally was a few over 100 throughout the state, and again about 55 or so in the Adirondacks, with 26 in the Adirondacks restored or in restoration. That leaves about half that number. And fire towers have a checkerboard of ownership too. Some towers are fully state-owned. Some are state-owned on private land. And I don't fully understand how that works. And so there's really an array of ownership. There's really a patchwork of ownership also, but obviously the ones that the state has purview over are the ones that it owns in entirety. So I hope that at least partially answers the question.
Yes, and a couple people posted in the chat that Loon Lake Fire Tower also has yet to be restored.
Oh, that's right. Of course, Loon Lake is a has a wonderful view. That's a tower that I can speak personally of. You also need to shinny up that one to really get a good bird's eye view of the view. It's got a great view north towards Canada and south towards the high peaks, and a bit into the lake country of north of Saranac Lake. So Loon Lake is a wonderful mountain, and Laurie with FFLA is much more on top of this question than I am, and has facilitated a number of groups and has reached agreement with DEC for restoration on a number of these towers. So Laurie and FFLA, thank you so much for that work and effort and initiative. It's a great job.
Yes, and while David focuses on Poke-O-Moonshine, at least in terms of Friends of Poke-O-Moonshine, there was a question about whether I wasn't sure if it was whether David focuses on other fire towers or if it was AARCH. But of course, the state chapter of the Forest Fire Lookout Association is really the umbrella that focuses more comprehensively on fire towers around the state. And they have a great Facebook page that you can see that and a website that Nolan has posted in our chat. Let's see, there are a couple other questions. David, how do you know, this is an interesting question, how many fires were spotted from Poco?
From Poco. That is a gap in my knowledge. I confess I do not know.
That would be an interesting one. There must be logs maybe out there somewhere. Somebody can do a research project on that. And then another question, which I like because sometimes I get a little nervous walking up the stairs, is why is the netting around the stairs typically waist height or in that range? Because is it a cost savings historically, or maybe they didn't really think about people who are a little bit acrophobic?
Well, all ages go up those towers, and several species also go up those towers. I have had to carry a big enthusiastic dog or two down a fire tower. They follow their people up, and then they get to the top, and they begin to set off back down to terra firma, and they see through the gap in the risers, and they want no part of it. And so it's just that extra measure of safety for kids, for dogs. I've often been glad it's there, and there are many people who are, some of whom I know quite well, who are quite iffy about climbing up fire towers, and for them it's not a hop, skip, and a jump as it is for the observers who've done it so many times.
Yes. Yes, I will attest to that. I always need to, I hiked Hurricane this summer with my daughter, and it was a very windy day, so I had to work up my courage to go up to the top, but I did.
It can be windy on Hurricane. It's named that way for a reason.
Exactly. So there's another question about one of our attendees who visited St. Regis this past fall and saw the recently installed spotter pictures, and they wanted to know if there are spotter pictures at other towers or plans for installing them, because they were really helpful in understanding the area.
As I said at some point, every tower has done it differently. I think it's based on the mountain, it's based on the use, it's based on the interest of the Friends group and its members. Poke-O-Moonshine has panoramic photos in the cab of the tower that show the view shed in all four directions as it looked in 2005. And I haven't seen the pictures in St. Regis and exactly what those are like, but I'm sure those would be fascinating. One of our purposes in showing, including panoramic photographs, is, of course, a common hiker question on top of a mountain is, what's that mountain? What's that mountain? What's that mountain? What's that mountain over there? This can save the time of the tower steward so that he or she doesn't need to spend most of his or her day identifying other peaks or other towns. And it can be an adventure for the hiker to try to spot them. They can actually use the map, the table map. They can use the alidade, and rather than spotting smoke, they can spot what's that mountain over there that's covered with all those scars. Some of those are slides, and my God, it looks like some of those are ski trails. And there's a pointy building on top of that mountain. Could that be Whiteface? And so we sort of add to the burden, if you will, of the hikers, so that they can explore the process and feel what it's like to either from photographs or from the map table and table map, find out just what that next door mountain is, what it's called, or what that city is, that huge city that's across Lake Champlain, and become a little bit adept at the kind of skill that a fire observer needed from that tower too. So and it's fun. So yeah. One of the questions we ask with our panoramic photographs, and we say we make a point, this is how it looked in 2005. How does it look now? Does it look the same? Does it look different? How is it the same? How is it different? Why is it the same? Why is it different? And that would fold into the story of the forest preserve. And yes, the forest preserve does look the same as it did, perhaps in 2005, or probably not in 1903 after all the fires, but it looks healthier and more fulsome, thanks in large part to the fire tower you're standing on. So to us, that's really part of the comprehensive message of fire towers, and we are thrilled that the DEC and the state now sees it that way and incorporates the full story of fire towers, and funds that awareness and that story.
Yes, absolutely. That is thanks to the efforts of people like you and so many of the people who are attending this webinar tonight, and AARCH's efforts before my time. So Jim Fox has his hand up. Jim, I'm giving you the microphone. Did you have anything you wanted? Jim is with the Stillwater Mountain Fire Tower Friends Group. Wasn't sure if the hand is up.
Yeah, David, you said you were not sure how it worked if towers were on private land. Stillwater, the trailhead is on state land, but you get halfway up the mountain and you get onto lime timber land, which used to be International Paper. The DEC wanted to get Stillwater open after it closed in 1988. And so they worked out in what they called an easement with lime timber that gives the public permission to use the trail, not go anywhere they want to go, but use the trail and then the tower. The property is leased to a private hunting club. So the tower is closed every year right after Columbus Day until the first day of winter. So nobody is allowed up then. But actually, I was a co-organizer of the Friends of Stillwater Fire Tower, and I think the fact that we are on private land really did make things easy. We had work days on Saturdays and Sundays in the fall and spring. We did not have DEC looking over our shoulders. We did everything ourselves. The Adirondack Mountain Club trail crew rehabbed our and actually changed the trail to get out of some real muddy areas. But I think it was an advantage because that tower would never have been taken down because it's on private property. So anyway, that's all I just wanted to mention. That's how it works.
Well, thank you,
Jim.
I think you would probably, I would guess that you would add what I was about to say was that, not only is identifying other peaks or other landmarks from fire towers or mountaintops fun, but the whole process of restoration that has brought together a lot of people. I've met a lot of great people, and we have made friendships and had fun doing this over the years. We weren't as pressured as Azure Mountain was, where they had the year. There was no imminent threat that the Poke-O-Moonshine Fire Tower would come down. So we had the luxury of being able to go a little more slowly with it. And as we said, the Friends began in 1997, and we considered Poco essentially restored by 2005, so 7-8 years or so. So we had the luxury of taking some time, but all of it was rewarding and fun, and has brought together a great group of friendly and generous people who love these little structures on mountaintops, and these structures that have so much history and importance to them.
Yes,
Good.
absolutely. I think that's a good way to close. Actually, I see we're coming up on 8:30, so we're hitting the 2-hour mark. I don't know if you have, those were great, perhaps unintentional parting words. I don't know if there was anything else you want to say before I give a few more closing statements.
I'm fine, Aaron. Thank you. Go for it.
Well, I'm going to start off by saying thank you, David, because with all of the technical difficulties tonight, you handled it all gracefully and wonderfully and gave a fascinating discussion. And I'm so glad that it was great to have your PowerPoint, but the lecture and the presentation you gave afterwards was also so interesting.
Thank you, everyone, for your interest and your patience. Aaron, Laurie, and all of you who've given and done so much for fire towers. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody.